The views and opinions expressed by the guests and hosts of this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the Lansdowne Public Library or its affiliates.
Welcome to the Lansdowne Public Library's Geek Out podcast,
where we geek out about just about anything.
Today, we are joined by two lovely people here to talk about the amazing and wonderful world of Nancy Drew.
I'm Hannah, and I'm a Nancy Drew collector, and I have two different Nancy Drew Instagram accounts. My most popular account is called nancy.drew.nerd.
I'm Megan. I'm also a Nancy Drew collector. Been collecting for a little over 20 years, and my Instagram handle is nancy.drew.collector. Wow,
okay. So I guess let's kick this off with, when you say you're a Nancy Drew collector, what does that entail?
It depends on who the collector is. Like, for me, I collect everything Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys that I can get my hands on, while Hannah is a little bit more particular.
So Megan tends to have, she collects a lot of books. So I have some books. There's a lot of different versions, a lot of different editions. I'm very particular about the specific collections that I collect. And then I also collect the core or other Nancy Drew themed items.
Yeah, and I collect like video games, board games, TV shows, everything, comic books, everything Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys that I can get my hands on. So anything that I see, even if it's like a little, like, this might be a little weird, but I have like a little ticket, like an old movie ticket from one of the movies. So like anything like that, memorabilia.
I've spent a lot of time around many film collectors. I can tell you with certainty that is not weird in the slightest. That's actually incredible.
Yeah, film tickets are actually a surprisingly common collectible.
I have a film reel too of one of the movie trailers, so that one was really fun to get.
Get out, an actual movie reel?
Yep, like a little. It's like not super old because it's just from the 2007 movie, but it's like a little reel and it has the trailer on it, and they played it in the theaters.
I honestly didn't think they were still using reels for trailers.
I know, I was kind of surprised.
That's the kind of collector stuff I love to hear. I love hearing that stuff.
That's a fairly unique piece. That is always cool. Let's take a bit of a step back here. So most people obviously would know Nancy Drew from the book series, but she's also been in, we've had TV shows, films, lots of games, and more. What would you say are some of your favorite parts of the brand?
Well, for me, I have always been more of a book person for Nancy. I like to collect the original text versions, but I also really love the TV shows. I don't know. I like all of it, but the books are definitely the core for me.
For me personally, I did read the books. I read them a little later. They're popular for kids who are younger. I didn't read them until I was an early teen. So I read the books when I was an early teen, and then I kind of wasn't into Nancy Drew for a little bit. And then my family, we discovered the Nancy Drew computer games. And so that was a really fun way for us all siblings to just play the games together and spend time together. And so that really relit my love for Nancy Drew, and we just kept playing the games. And so after doing that for a few years, I started going back and starting my own collection. So I do like the yellow books is what I call them, but just the hardcover yellow Nancy Drew books. They're not in print anymore, but I like collecting those. So I have a whole set of those, and I like having the games as well.
So I guess I'll be a little bit more specific like you were. So I was handed my first Nancy Drew book when I was 7, maybe even sooner, but I didn't care about it at first. I thought it looked old and boring. But then once I finally read it, I became obsessed. And my mom started helping me figure out how to get all the original versions. And then eventually we went into Walmart and we found the game. So I went down that rabbit hole, and then I found the TV shows. It's like a whole thing. And now I'm just over the top.
Okay, so we sort of have a baseline. For anyone who's not super in the know, because we carry a wide variety of topics here. So just for a little, I guess, background, how would you best describe Nancy Drew?
She's usually called a teen sleuth or teen detective. She's 18 in the books. Originally, she was 16, but they pretty soon changed her to 18, and she just stays 18 throughout like all the series. So teen sleuth is probably best.
Whenever I think of that kind of genre, just tons of names just start flooding in. So I know I'm not as familiar, and I did not know Nancy Drew was a teen, much less 18, but I mean, that's beside the point.
The Hardy Boys are around the same age. They were 17 and 18. So they're also the teen sleuths. And my favorite actually is when they meet up and they do mysteries together.
How often does that occur?
Well, in the 70s TV show, they actually had It was the Nancy Drew Mysteries and the Hardy Boys Mysteries. So it was a combined show every other week. It was Nancy Drew, then Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, and then they would meet for episodes sometimes. They did that in the 90s for a short-lived Canada series as well. But in the 80s, they actually had quite a few spin-off books series, like together, where they solved the mysteries together. There's like two book series, kind of. It's kind of hard to explain because there's like random spin-offs. And then there's from 2019, a comic book series called The Big Lie, and that's also Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys.
There's like 2 or 3 Nancy Drew computer games where the Hardy Boys are characters in it, and they help Nancy solve the mystery. Sometimes they're phone characters that Nancy can call when she's solving the mystery, so they kind of have both in the games too.
There's even one Hardy Boys PC game where Nancy Drew makes an appearance. So it happens pretty often.
That sounds delightful, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it is always kind of fun to have that sort of shared universe for characters.
Let's get back to it. Let's focus on the real Teen Sleuth. Although I say that, and I don't
technically no. The Hardy Boys are, I think, 4 years older.
Yeah, the Hardy Boys came out in 1927, and Nancy came in 1930.
Yeah, and I know Edward Stratemeyer did another series even before the Hardy Boys. So
yeah, there was quite a few.
It was a very popular genre at the time, and has maintained that popularity very well, surprisingly.
Yeah.
Nancy just had her 93rd anniversary of when the first couple books came out. And so Megan and I celebrated, and we went book hunting together to look for different Nancy Drew books together.
Yeah, the first 3 Nancy Drew books came out on April 28th, 1930.
Doesn't surprise me as much as I think it would, but...
Yeah, it's an interesting marketing plan, right? I'm just going to release 3 books all at once.
Yeah, and then Edward Stratemeyer actually died before the 4th one could come out, but he made the outline for it, and then he died, and he never got to see the success of Nancy Drew.
He gave it all he had.
Yep.
You might want to explain the Carolyn Keene aspect, Megan, because we haven't mentioned her name. People probably don't know who Edward is.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. That's right.
I don't know anything about Nancy Drew, so please, if you have any information, just start dropping it.
Maybe start a little bit at the beginning there.
Okay.
Well, as I recall, the author given credit at least was a pen name, right?
Yes, it was Carolyn Keene. It was originally written by Mildred Wirt Benson under that name. Edward Stratemeyer, who created the Stratemeyer Syndicate, he actually hired Mildred Wirt Benson because she was writing under a ghost name for his Ruth Fielding series, and he really liked it. And after the success of the Hardy Boys, he wanted something that would appeal more to girls. So he hired her, and he gave her the outline, but she basically formed the character of Nancy Drew. She was kind of a real-life Nancy Drew in her own sense. Like, she literally was kidnapped by Mayans because they thought she was a princess. She went on archaeological digs. She flew planes. She was really, really cool. She was basically a real-life Nancy Drew, and she formed the character, the original character, and then many, many, like dozens of other authors have written under the name Carolyn Keene. And the books are still being written today. So, yeah, countless authors. Books 1 through 34 have 2 different texts. They all originally had 25 chapters, and then in 1959, Harriet Stratemeyer Adams, the daughter of Edward Stratemeyer, she just decided she wanted things a little different. It was because of cost to shorten the books, and it was just to modernize them a little bit. And she kind of started making Nancy very watered down and prim and proper, not as like bold and edgy and sassy. She wanted her to be the way she thought women should be. So in 1959, all 1 through 34 were revised, and then 35 through 56 were made in that way, in the same way that the revisions were.
That's insane.
So the first 34 books all got a revision. How is that the only time they've done that, or have
the Hardy Boys
books gotten further revisions?
No, not really. No, it was just books 1 through 34. The same thing happened with Hardy Boys. I can't remember how many volumes with that. But it went from 25 chapters to 20 chapters, and 8 of the books were given completely different plots, which is crazy.
So in those 8 cases, then there are just 2 different books.
Yeah, some are less different than others, but most of them are completely different.
That's utterly wild.
Same thing with the Hardy Boys. I think it was 12 of them were completely changed for the Hardy Boys.
Did they kept the same titles though? So
Somewhat, yeah. They were the same titles. They would change at or of and change those around a little bit, but basically the same titles. So it was the secret. I can't remember which was first, but Secret of Shadow Ranch and Secret at Shadow Ranch, stuff like that.
Minor changes to the titles, but sometimes severe changes to the storylines.
Yes. And like even the ones that weren't changed completely, sometimes they did have completely like new subplots added or subplots taken out, stuff like that too.
I mean, in your opinions, which of these is better? Is the original the better read, or did the revisions fix some things that were worth fixing?
Well, in my opinion, the original ones are better in the sense that Nancy was way cooler and like she was just awesome. Like I don't know how better to describe it than she was a badass. Like she was so cool. And then she was just watered down when the revisions happened.
For my part, I grew up reading the revised text, so that's what I'm familiar with. So that's what I would lean towards because that's what I read to begin with. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean they're better. That's just what I'm familiar with personally.
Well, the good thing about the revised text, though, is that they did take most of the racist content out. So that's like the really good thing.
Yeah, I imagine books written in the 1930s might not meet certain standards of, even at the 70s, those would have probably been viewed as problematic. And today, goodness, who knows?
Yeah, and even the revisions, like they were considered fine then, like updating it, but like now we would still look at the revisions and see racist stuff, you know. So, but in my opinion, that's the only upside of the revisions.
What is like the Nancy Drew fandom at large think? Is there like any ongoing discussion, or is it?
It depends on what age group you're talking to. Older people, because there's like a whole huge community of collectors. And a lot of them are older, so most of them do prefer the original text. But I think a lot of people around our age, 20s, 30s, they probably prefer the revised text because that's what they grew up with. I was just weird and I wanted to read everything I could. So I got the original text. But I think most people who are young prefer the revised text.
It makes sense. It's familiarity is always going to be kind of part of that. Like their nostalgia is the newer stuff. So
yeah.
They'll feel more of a kinship there.
So that's only the first through 34. Who took up the mantle next, and what was it like? Because I'm imagining this in more of like almost like a comic book sense of like, okay, after these writers, you know, someone else started doing these issues. Who is like the next big Nancy Drew author?
It was Harriet Adams who really was the big author after 34 because she wanted to take over and do things the way she wanted. Not everybody's going to see it that way, but that's how a lot of us see it. So she took over writing or giving the outlines. So sometimes she'd write them, sometimes she'd give the outlines to other authors, but it was mostly Harriet Stratemeyer Adams who did it. And then let me just check a date really quick because I want to mention one other thing. Hannah, if there's anything you want to say.
Not about the books. My primary knowledge about Nancy Drew at this point is the games. I am super obsessed with the games, and so that's what I primarily focus on, and that's the community that I'm involved in. So it's a little bit different than Megan. We both love Nancy Drew. We just both have a different focus of which aspect of Nancy Drew we like best.
And I love the games too. I don't have as much knowledge as Hannah does on the games.
One other thing that we wanted to mention is that we met because of Nancy Drew. So we met through our online Instagram accounts, and because we had similar followers, similar accounts, you know, we were interacting. And we realized that we actually live not too far away from each other. So we met up in 2020 for the first time. We met partway to go book hunting, went around looking for different Nancy Drew books at different bookshops. And we've gone together a few times since then to go shopping together. So it's fun to have someone who understands what we're looking for. And then we can look at the shelves and see which editions we're looking for, what titles we're looking for to finish or complete our collection.
Yeah, because neither of us really have people like in our real lives that care about Nancy Drew like we do.
That can be kind of the norm for certain fandoms where it's, you know, the internet has been a big boon to a lot of people and a lot of the more niche collector fields especially.
Yeah. Okay, so this is what I was trying to find. So after the books ended with 56, in 1979, the books began to be published by Wanderer Books under Simon & Schuster in paperback format. So in 1979, there was a court battle actually between Stratemeyer Syndicate and Grosset and Dunlap. And Grosset and Dunlap was the original publishers for Nancy Drew. So they lost, Grosset and Dunlap lost, and the Stratemeyer Syndicate was sold to Simon & Schuster. So then volumes 57 through 78 were published in paperback under Simon & Schuster. Their children's imprint was Wanderer, so that's what it was. And we call those the Nancy Drew digests. And then it wasn't really just until 78, but when 78 ended, that was the end of the Stratemeyer Syndicate's involvement in Nancy Drew. And then after 78, it just kept continuing from 79 to 175. So most collectors don't consider those canon. So it usually ends with 78 as canon for Nancy Drew.
So it's less than half is considered canon.
Yeah. But I mean, there's even more than that, because during the publication of the rest of the so-called, like, the original series, there was the Nancy Drew Files series, which was the 80s and 90s, and that had, I think, 124 titles, and that's also not really considered canon. There's like a ton of spin-offs. I think there's like 14 if you include like everything, like 14 different series. So there's a lot.
Yeah, I had no idea that. I assumed some of the spin-offs would probably be more or less popular than the others, but to hear that most of the books in the original series even are considered sort of non-canonical is kind of remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, some people
suppose
only consider 1 through 56 canon, but technically it's 78.
And this feels like another Star Wars situation.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like I did grow up reading all of the Star Wars books that don't count anymore. So, I mean, I guess I can kind of relate to that. But out of curiosity, do you know, is this also true for like the Hardy Boys? Do they have a hard cut point as well? Or are they more?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when it was. I think it was like 64 or something. I can't remember exactly, but they had the same exact thing. So there's also maybe not as many, but almost as many series for the Hardy Boys. And like they were usually published at the same time. So during the Nancy Drew Files, there was the Hardy Boys Case Files. And then the Nancy Drew, like the paperbacks after the originals, the same thing for the Hardy Boys. There's the Nancy Drew Girl Detective, which came right after the original series, after 175. That happened in 2003. And simultaneously, that was the Hardy Boys Undercover Brothers. And now, since those two ended, it's been the Nancy Drew Diaries and the Hardy Boys Adventures, I think. I haven't read those ones yet. There's more series than that, but those are like the main ones.
Well, let's head over to the other side of the media here for a bit, and let's talk a little bit about the new, or, well, I guess not entirely new, but the Nancy Drew computer games.
The first game came out in the late 90s, and they started releasing them. They had about 2 per year for a while that they would bring out. They made them all the way up until 2015, and then they kind of had a break. It was 4 years before we got a new game, so 2019 is the last time we got a new game. But there were a lot of changes. They changed the platform for the game, changed the voice actress, a lot of different things changed. And since that game, there's been another break. So we hadn't really heard a lot about the newest game since 2019 until this year. On April Fool's Day, they actually posted and said, we're going to make a new game. And that kind of was controversial because people didn't believe them, or they weren't sure whether to believe them or not.
That seems reasonable.
Yep.
I figured it wasn't. I didn't think it was a joke because I think after everybody being so bad about Midnight in Salem, which I don't understand personally, I don't think they were stupid enough to make a joke out of that. And I've kind of worked with them behind the scenes a little bit on some collaborative posts. And based on their mindset, I did not see that as a joke. So I wasn't worried, but I know like a lot of people were.
So they released a lot of clues and puzzles from April to like the end of May. Every few days or every week or so, they would have a giant puzzle they put on social media. And if you solved it, then you got clues and you got more info. So they just released the name of the game, Mystery of the Seven Keys. They don't have a release date. They've kind of shown you the characters that are going to be in it, but there's not a trailer yet. So the last game, it seems like it might be following so much of the last game. It's the same voice actress. The game in 2019 was very mixed reviews from fans, about 50-50-ish, somewhere around there, of whether people liked it or not. And as Megan mentioned, it was called Midnight in Salem. I personally did not play it, but Megan did, and she actually is one of the people who did like it.
I really enjoyed it. It was more modern with the graphics and stuff. And the issue was that a lot of people couldn't get it to play on their computer. So I think that was a big reason why people didn't like it. But I didn't have any issues, and I really, really enjoyed it, actually. But about the new game that's coming out, what is it? The Mystery of the Seven
Keys. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Something that's really cool is the Nancy Drew game fans are kind of crazy. So we knew the title before it was released because people found that it had been trademarked and stuff. Like it's really cool. We find out things before we're supposed to.
That's what happens when you have detective fans.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just really fun.
Dedicated fans will find ways of just sort of finding information they're not supposed to.
Yeah.
You could never be mad at oh, our entire fan base is built around solving mysteries. How could they have possibly figured out all of
This
our
out. Yeah.
like, yeah, at that point it's like, all right, you guys got it.
I'm curious, besides the apparent fact that it just, for some people, didn't work, what made Midnight in Salem so different that it became a kind of controversial figure in the games?
I think one of the main things was just that they changed the voice actress. It was the first time we hadn't had Lani Minella, and I really like her voice. She's the voice of Nancy in the first 32 games, and I just can't get past that. I don't know if I'm going to play the new game. I'm waiting to see more, find out more information about it, but I have Nancy's voice in my head, and that's kind of what I'm stuck on, is that. And so I think a lot of fans didn't like the fact that Nancy's voice has changed. As Megan said, it didn't work on everyone's computer. They had a lot of glitches as they were trying to change platforms. They didn't seem like they waited maybe long enough to iron out all those things. They did produce a game, but it wasn't quite there yet. So I think this next game, it does look more put together. So they've taken time. They probably have a better handle on how this is going to go forward. They've taken a longer time to get it situated.
And I think part of it is that we were spoiled. We got 2 games a year, which is not really normal for video games. So we were spoiled. But I think personally, like, I'm on the other end. I think it was good that they changed these things, because with the current TV show, Nancy was getting popular again. More people were wanting to explore the world of Nancy Drew. They needed to modernize the games. Like, yes, the games were great for people who have been there all along, but I personally think they really needed to make them more appealing to newer people, modernize it, making the graphics look better. I loved Lani Minella. I can never say her name. I loved her voice, but I like the new voice better because she sounds younger. Lonnie's voice she sounded old. She didn't sound like an 18-year-old, you know? She's classic. I will always love her as Nancy Drew, but I really feel like the new voice of Nancy Drew sounds like what I would think Nancy would sound like. So I don't personally have issues about it. And I will be playing the game no matter what. If I can get it to work, I guess. If it works on all of our computers.
I am admittedly kind of curious how you can make because I assume it is still like the old games, a point-and-click adventure, yeah?
Yeah.
Not exactly. I don't know what the right term is, but the old ones were point and click adventure. This is more, you can just fluidly move throughout the entire location.
More open world.
So.
Ish. Yeah. It's still like pointing and clicking, like still like the same kind of thing, but it's more open and you can go more places than you could before in the games.
Okay. I suppose that does answer my question, because I was wondering how a point and click adventure could be taxing anyone's computer.
Yeah. And the graphics are
suppose...
so much better, so...
I have not played one in a while, but as I remember them, they were all very solid little point-and-click adventure games. So.
Yeah, they were really, really great. Like for the time and everything. It's just like they don't necessarily hold up with current games.
But if people haven't played them, I would definitely encourage people to go back. I might not start with the super early numbers. I like the stories of some of the early games, but the graphics just don't compare to the more recent ones. So I still love them because I grew up on them. And if you learn to love the games, learn to love Nancy, you probably enjoy those mysteries too. But if you're coming in and you haven't played a game, you'd probably want to start somewhere in like the teens, maybe a little higher than that. You could go to the end of the series, but then I think you would be spoiled again working backwards because the graphics get increasingly better. So I would start in like the middle of the games and then kind of work your way forward from there.
Plus, the earlier games won't even work on computers anymore for the most part. So, unfortunately, it's actually harder to play them now.
So you said you would be spoiled working backwards. You said spoiled graphically. Is there any sort of storyline that connects the games, or can they be played in any order?
You can definitely play them in any order. There's one game that includes a previous character, but for the most part, they don't build too much on each other. Nancy has several friends, Bess and George, famously from the books, and so they're in the games. But mostly it's Nancy discovers a mystery, she goes on vacation, discovers a mystery, or she gets hired to go on a mystery. So they're basically standalone. So you could definitely, we didn't play them in order, you could definitely play them in any order.
Yeah, it's kind of like the books. They're just standalone mysteries. There's like recurring characters. Like in the games, there's a guy named Sunny June, and you don't have to play them in order, but if you do, you'll see like him throughout the game kind of, and then he eventually comes in one of the games as an actual character. But before, he's kind of just like a character that seems to show up where Nancy is, but you never actually see him. So there's stuff like that, but overall, you really don't need to play them in order.
Okay. So then that leads into my next question. What game specifically would you say, like, all right, this one is great, since they're not in order, I'm assuming you could say start here. What's like the best game to start with, do you think?
Her and I have different opinions on this one.
You can share first, and then I'll say which games I think.
Okay, I personally think The Ghost of Thornton Hall is a really good one to start with because it's fairly easy, but it's still really fun to solve all the puzzles and it's kind of spooky. I like spooky games. So I think that one's a really good one to start off with because it's not going to be too difficult for a first timer who's not used to it.
I'd suggest game number 9, which is a little earlier than what I was suggesting before, but it's Danger on Deception Island. I think the atmosphere is really, really great. It's a very popular game. Secret of Shadow Ranch is pretty popular too. Curse of Blackmore Manor, that's also another like fan favorite. That's 9, 10, and 11. So those games are pretty general core Nancy Drew games that people like. I personally really like Warnings at Waverly Academy. That's a much more recent one. I think the characters are really fun in that one. So Nancy gets to go around and she's always first person. She's solving the mystery. You don't get to see Nancy, but you get to interrogate the suspects. You get to find clues. You get to do puzzles and things like that. And so I like all of the different people that she gets to interact with in that game. And I just like that particular mystery.
I will say real quick, for those who haven't played the games, you're actually playing as Nancy Drew. I don't know if we mentioned that, but we're playing as Nancy Drew, so you get to be the detective, I guess. I don't know. So that's why we never see her, like Hannah said, because we are her.
Keep you in the first person view, so you're in that headspace, I suppose. Out of morbid curiosity, how about the inverse? Are there any of the games, other than potentially the one that might not work on all computers, were there any that were just kind of lackluster or maybe less polished than the others?
That definitely varies by fan. I mean, I can name some, but if you ask other fans, they might be like, oh no, that's some of my favorites. I think it does depend on what order you played them in. Not that they're necessarily better, but there's one game, Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, that takes place in Pennsylvania, actually. I don't personally prefer that game. I think it's fine, but I just don't feel that the mystery is something I enjoy as much. There's not as many characters either. But for a lot of fans, that was one of their very first games they played. And so they'll say that this is a really good game. So in their opinion, they really like it. There's some I don't like. I think they're harder. Just the mystery. I don't like the final scene. It's a kidnapping mystery in an old theater. I just don't enjoy it. It's the puzzles and everything. I don't enjoy it. I don't like The Silent Spy. That's another one that people don't enjoy. But I find it too sad. It's about Nancy's mother. Nancy's mother died when she was a little girl. And so the computer game, The Silent Spy, is going to investigate what happened to her mother when she died. And I don't like it. I find it too serious, too sad. And so I prefer to play other games.
I love The Silent Spy because in the books, we don't get to hear much about her mom. We just know that she died of a sudden illness. But in the game, they make it so that she died because she's a secret spy.
Mm-hmm. So it's which apparently really Nancy didn't know.
Yeah, so we got to just learn a lot more. So I tend to dislike some of the more popular ones. I did not really like Waverly Academy very much. I don't really like Shadow Ranch very much. But
I think see a difference of opinions even in the two of us.
Yeah. But I think one that's pretty common to not like is number 30, The Shattered Medallion. Mm-hmm. I can't stand that one because I think there's just not much of a mystery to it. So I think it was just kind of a disappointment, especially because that's the game where we meet the character Sunny June. And that character has kind of been teased to us since almost the beginning of the game series. Mm-hmm. And so it was just kind of a disappointment to meet him in that game. And it's just not very, I don't really like that game.
It's interesting because that has been a very unpopular game in general. People will quote it as being one of the worst games. I didn't see that at first when I played it, and I went to replay it within the last year. And I started playing it, and then I realized graphically, it's a beautiful game. There's nice locations, but there's not a whole lot that you can really explore. And there's not much of a mystery, as she said. You're basically on a game show, and so there's things to do, but there's not a mystery that's forcing you, really pushing the story forward, really helping you feel like I'm accomplishing something. I'm going to find these clues. I'm going to really do something good here. And it's just not as interesting to replay.
It's kind of surface level in a way. There's just not much to it.
It is a little unorthodox, I realize, but I'm forward to this luxury by today's format. You guys have been talking about it, and I've had the Nancy Drew Steam search up, so I can see most of these games, and pretty much everything you two have been like, it wasn't so great. It seems like that's across the board. Is everyone's like, everything is great except these few games.
Yep.
Which I find astounding, given by how many of these games that there are, and most of them are like, yep, it's great. And then these other ones, no, it's not so good.
It
But
is
even the
funny.
not so good ones, they're mixed reviews.
Certainly.
Mhm.
None of them
is-
have an overwhelmingly negative response.
Yeah.
And it really does depend on the fan because some games are much harder or there's always characters to interact with. There's always puzzles to solve or clues to find, but some games are really heavy on puzzles and they're not easy puzzles. Like you can spend a long time solving these puzzles. They get very complex and some detectives really like that. And so there are games that there's just puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. And so some people are just going to like that. And other detectives are going to say, I just want a game where I get to find a story. Like I can just really investigate, really talk to people, find out what their motives were, why they might have done this crime. And so somewhat it does depend on what the people like, but some games are definitely generally better than others.
Yeah, like some people love the spooky games like I do, but like Hannah does not like the spooky games. So again, it really does depend on your taste and what you look for in a game.
It is amusing because, I've only played a few of these myself, and of them, I have actually played The Silent Spy,
Okay.
which I generally remember enjoying quite a bit.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Because I pulled up a list of names. The only other name that stuck out, and I know I've played more of these because my sister had a lot of them and I frequently stole her games. The other one I remember playing a lot was the Shadow at Water's Edge.
Oh, that one's fun. I really like that one.
That
That
one
one
is,
had some very complicated puzzles in it, as I
it
recall.
does. And it also is one of the spookier games. So it's a good game, but definitely there's a few jump scares in it. So
Oh, yes.
they made it very intentionally creepy with all the hauntings that are supposedly going on in the Ryokan.
Also, all of the games except I'm not sure about the new game, but all of the games are based on a Nancy Drew book, at least loosely. And the titles don't always match up, but they're all based at least a little bit on a Nancy Drew book.
Now, does that sometimes spoil anything in the games? Like
They
if
change
you
it
have-
enough. No, they changed it
So
enough.
they make sure that you don't come in with all of the information. That's good.
Yeah, like for instance, Stay Tuned for Danger, which is my favorite game. The ending is a lot less dark than the book. I'll say that. The book is pretty dark, and they don't go down that route really in the games.
Wow, that is sort of the inverse of what I would expect.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that is having not read many of the books, I kind of assumed that they were for a younger audience, so some of the darker tones would have been lessened in the books.
Well, the Nancy Drew File series, which is what that one book is from, that is aimed towards older teens, and it was kind of in the same era as like Sweet Valley High and Fear Street and stuff. So they were trying to gravitate towards that audience. So those ones are a little darker. It has more romance. It has murder and all of that stuff, drugs. Like it tackles more serious mysteries and stuff. So quite a few of the games are based on those books, but they don't tackle as much of the serious stuff.
Or even like one of the books that I read after playing the game. It's definitely different because in the book it's describing a story and Nancy will go around talking to people, but the puzzles that they put in the games don't really exist in real life. So when you're like, oh, well, I need this piece of evidence and this piece and this piece, and this will give me the clue or the passcode combination, they incorporate all of that stuff. That's not in the book. They wrote that, they added that in. So even though it might be similar locations, you're still going around and you're still finding like, oh, here's a scrap of paper with a combination on the floor, or here's something else, or here's a different place to explore that they created. So it's a little different, and just the way you interact with the environment is different when you're reading it compared to actually exploring it in the game.
Yeah, and some of the books the games are based on, I don't understand how they're based on it. It's so different. Like, for instance, the book that The Curse of Blackmore Manor is based on is completely different. I don't understand where they got any of it from. So yeah, it's not usually a spoiler. I mean, I think there's a couple where it's the same culprit, but usually it's different.
I guess I shouldn't be that surprised considering there were 8 books in the series that are just completely replaced with another book that they maybe came up with different scenarios for the games as well.
Yeah.
On the development front, that's got to be kind of fun because then you can pull from sort of 2 different versions of the story. You get a little chance to pick and choose and still be very accurate.
Yeah, for sure.
We've done games, we've done books. Hannah, how well are you versed with the film and television series of Nancy Drew? Did the games capture your heart enough to turn on your television set?
I am a game girl. Megan is super into the TV shows and the movies. I have seen some of them, and they're okay. They're not how maybe I would portray Nancy. I saw one of the movies that's from early-ish 1900s and Hidden Staircase, which came out not too long ago. They're all right, but they're not necessarily how I would view Nancy from having read the books.
I'm working on her. I'm going to get her to watch them.
Who is Hannah's Nancy Drew?
So when I read the books, because that's what came up first, she's very pleasant and nice. She's very polite. She's very helpful. She wants to help people. That's why she's doing it. And in the books, it's not because she's being hired or things like that. She's doing it because maybe she passed by someone and they have a need and she wants to help. Or maybe she saw something and so she really wants to help. And so she's very smart. Her father is a lawyer and he factors into some of the books and into some of the games. And her friends help her solve the mystery. Sometimes she just happens to be staying somewhere and they observe something strange. But generally, Nancy is very smart and she'll be able to put together the clues. I like the kind of person that she is. She's a person of good character in the way that she goes about helping people. She's not in it for the money. She's not in it for the fame, even though obviously Nancy Drew is a famous name. But the character itself, that's not what her motivation is. She's not trying to be famous. She's not trying to be in the newspaper article. She's doing it because she cares about other people. So I like that. One of the things I like best about Nancy Drew is just the memories you can create because of Nancy Drew. And that's what I was talking about with spending time with my family. I have a lot of positive associations with just spending time with Nancy with my family. And so that's another reason why I like her specifically. But you should ask Megan the same question if you're going to ask me.
Yeah, I was thinking similarly. How does that line up with how you view Nancy Drew?
I actually completely agree with her. Those are all the things I love about Nancy and how I see her. I also like when they bring in a little bit of original text Nancy because that's how she was intended. So I like when she's a little sassy and bold and daring. For example, in the revised text, Nancy drives at a respectful pace and does not go above the speed limit even when she's chasing criminals. And in the original text, she doesn't care. She just drives and chases the criminals as fast as she can go. So I prefer original Nancy in that sense. But all of those things that Hannah mentioned is also just Nancy in general. So I agree with her. And I also really love how Nancy is multi-generational. So like a child now can relate with her grandmother because they've both connected with that same character, you know? So I really, really like that because she's been like a part of every generation, basically.
My mom remembers like waiting every week till the next Nancy Drew book came out. So like, or maybe not every week, but she would wait and she'd get the new one as soon as it came out. She built up her collection. And so then I read my mother's collection and my mom actually has some of her mother's collection. So we have even the same thing, the same generations, and it will keep going forward because it's still popular today. There are still young children who are just picking up the series and they want to read every single book there is about Nancy.
We have a patron at the library who has run out of Nancy Drew books to read. She has picked up all of them, and now she seems to be working her way through the Hardy Boys.
Wow.
I'm pretty sure she's gotten through them too. I haven't seen as many come through the requests in a while.
That's hard to do because there's over 600 of both Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. So I haven't even done that.
I don't think she's done because I know she's done, you know, the ones you described as the yellow books.
Yes. So it's probably
she's done all of
for the reprints of the classic series.
Yeah.
The classic series 1 through 56.
Right, which is now they're in print. They're called the Flashlight series. So those are the ones that you can very easily get your hands on. Those are still in print. Other ones that you might have to find it like online on like eBay or at a book sale or something like that, or a used bookstore.
Yeah, the only ones that are still in print, like Hannah said, are the Flashlight editions, and they are glossy yellow books. That's the only way you can still find those in like new stores, I guess. The original texts aren't even in print anymore. You can only get those if you buy vintage copies. And then 1 through 21 was reprinted in the 90s, like exactly how they looked in the 30s. So you can also get those a little bit newer, but you mostly have to do some searching.
I would not be surprised if some of our libraries had 1 or 2 of those old ones, because typically we don't really get rid of books unless they're damaged beyond repair or no one is reading them. So if someone hasn't eaten the book, I'm sure your local library might even have some of these really old editions. Maybe even kept in the back if they're that beloved, but still in good condition. They might be in a library's archive.
Maybe.
And I've had good success at a library's book sale being able to find a lot of editions. They get donated to a library. People want someone that's going to care about them to have it if they need to clear out their collection, or if they're moving, or if maybe if someone passed away in their family, they want to pass it on to someone else. And so I've had good success finding them places like that.
Yeah. Also, a good way to tell the difference between original text and revised text, I forgot to mention this. The original text has 25 chapters. Did I say this? And the revised text has 20. Yeah, okay. So people will think that they have the original version because the copyright inside will say like 1930 or whatever. But you actually can't go by the copyright dates in Nancy Drew or Hardy Boys books. Yeah.
Right, because that's not when it's printed. That's just when the text is copyrighted. So I was confused by that. And Megan had to correct me and explain that to me because I thought I had older books than I did, but that's not accurate.
The only way to actually tell the exact date and edition of your book is with the Farrah's Guide. Basically, like the Nancy Drew Bible, it'll tell you everything you need to know, exactly how to tell what you have. There's like some guides online that'll give you like a rough estimate, but that's the only way to actually tell exactly what you have for the original series.
Now, I'm a little curious, admittedly, because we went over this a little bit for the games, but are there specific books that are, your favorites or the ones you would recommend someone to read?
I usually like to recommend The Hidden Staircase. I don't personally like the first book, The Secret of the Old Clock, very much, but The Hidden Staircase is a fun, like, ghost story. That's one of my favorite ones, and that's one of the ones that has two completely different plots, so I usually tell them to try to get the original one because it's a little better. My personal favorite is the original text version of The Secret in the Old Attic, just because it's very nostalgic for me. But I know a lot of people sometimes have trouble getting into the original series as an adult. So I also like to recommend the Nancy Drew Files series since it's geared towards older readers. So one of my favorites of those, I can't remember the number, but it's called The Perfect Plot. I really like that one because there's a lot of hidden rooms and secret passageways and stuff. So that's a really fun one I like to recommend to people to start out with.
I would suggest people to start at The Secret of the Old Clock. I tend to just list that one as my top favorite because I don't have a specific favorite, and it's just starting at number one. So I would just start at the beginning and go through the series. I would say the easiest ones to get your hands on would be the flashlight editions. They're not going to be the older text like Megan's saying, but then that's the easiest ones that you'll be able to find, or at a news store, that's what they sell. And you could just try reading a couple of those. They're definitely similar to each other, but each one will have certainly a different plot to it or different characters.
I don't usually recommend the first one because me personally, if I started with the first one, I don't know if I would have continued the series. So that's why I don't personally recommend that one.
With so much Nancy Drew content and so many differing viewpoints, it is nice to hear varying opinions on, where people should start and why people should start.
I was just going to say, I know we touched on the TV show, but I just want to say, I personally really like most of them. I know Hannah was saying she said they were okay, and I agree with the ones that she's saying. Like, the 30s movies, they're fine. They make her kind of dumb, and they're silly, like they're more comedies. And the 2019 Hidden Staircase movie, I can't stand. It's terrible, in my opinion. I went to see it in the theaters with a friend, and we were the only ones who didn't leave in the middle of the movie. But the 70s TV show, I love. She screams Nancy Drew to me. Pamela Sue Martin is such a great revised text Nancy, in my opinion. I think they did a really great job of capturing the essence of the books. The 90s series is based on the Nancy Drew Files series, and I think they did a pretty good job with that. She doesn't look like Nancy, but I think she did a great job playing Nancy, and I think it has the best on-screen portrayals of her best friends, Bess and George. And then the 2007 movie is fine. I don't like how they portrayed Nancy, but the rest of the movie I think is really good. And then the current TV show, it's very different. They made it supernatural and more horror. But I really think the actress who plays Nancy does a fantastic job mixing original text Nancy and modern Nancy together. And she's actually a fan of Nancy Drew. She grew up reading the books and playing the games. I think she's just been a really great Nancy Drew. And I really like the current show because they do a lot of Easter eggs that only real Nancy Drew, book and game fans will understand. So I think they do a really great job of respecting the source material. So that was my spiel.
Something else we should touch on is upcoming Nancy Drew things.
Ooh, yeah, what's next for Nancy Drew?
So recently there's been info released about a Broadway show, a musical for Nancy Drew. And the music is actually being done by Alan Menken. So it should be a pretty big deal. I don't know exactly when the release date is yet, but it's in the works and it's coming at some point soon.
Yeah, the people who who are doing the Broadway musical, they messaged me and they said they don't have any plans right now exactly of when they're coming out. They're in the very, very early stages, but it's got huge Broadway names attached to it, which is so cool. I heard years ago that they were making a Broadway Nancy Drew musical, but then COVID happened, so like it kind of screwed things up a bit. I wasn't sure at first if it was actually even going to happen, but it's officially like actually in the works. So that is so cool.
A step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
It's funny, we did one of these on musicals not too long ago, so it's been interesting just seeing how often those have been popping up for other popular media lately. And yeah, getting Alan Menken, that's a big deal.
Yeah, really cool.
Another recent thing with Nancy Drew is they just did a Kickstarter for officially licensed Nancy Drew action figures. So that's something new, and they more than doubled what they needed to fund it. So that's in the works. They're making action figures. They're even bringing out a new book to go with it.
Now, are these the first toys that they've made for Nancy Drew?
These are the first action figures ever. There's been some dolls. There was like a Madame Alexander doll, and then there was another doll that came out the same time as the 2007 movie. But this is the first action figure we've ever had. And there's quite a few different action figures that are coming out. And like Hannah said, they're also coming out with a book, and it's Kickstarter exclusive. So you can only get it if you pledge it. And this is a novella that is written by the current Carolyn King, the person who is currently writing the Nancy Drew Diary series. And the cover was actually painted by Ruth Sanderson, who did the first few Nancy Drew Digest books. So it's very, very, very cool.
I just pulled up the Kickstarter out of curiosity, and I had a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? I had something of a flashback because I remember this cover, the Crooked Banister. My sister must have had this book because that silly looking robot
Weird, I know.
burned into my memory. And there's a part of me that's like, I should buy this for her just because I need to know somebody who owns this ridiculous robot.
Yeah, I think that's one of the least favorite Nancy Drew books. I was kind of surprised they were making that an action figure. It's not a great book. It's such a silly cover.
But it is a fantastic cover, yeah.
I think they did some individual action figures just based on Nancy off of the covers, and they did a couple that were like sets. And there's not that many covers that have a bunch of people or two people you could easily do. And so I guess that's why they went towards that one.
I think you're right.
But it's a very strange book. It's definitely not my favorite book by any means.
No, it's not great.
For the listening audience, just imagine any 1950s movies robot, preferably if it was made predominantly of aluminum foil.
Yep, so that's what you'd have.
Yeah, that's so true.
Seems
but yeah, so it's officially going through the project. Like, it made a lot more than they expected. And they keep adding more, too. They're adding a t-shirt or something. I don't know, but it's really, really cool.
Well, and I think they also intend, if this goes well, they're intending to bring out other action figures in the future, right?
Yes, they're going to make more if this actually is successful, which it looks like it's definitely going to be. And this is great because it shows Simon & Schuster that there's still a want for Nancy Drew merchandise. So I'm hoping we'll get actual, like, more merchandise now because we haven't had any in a very long time.
That does strike me as a little surprising given, you have a franchise that's, 93 years old?
I mean, we didn't even get stuff for the TV show. Like, most of the CW shows, you get merchandise like Funko Pops and stuff. Yeah. We only got 2 t-shirts and that's it. And then some stuff from Comic-Con. We got some like little goodies there, but nothing like actual merch-wise, except 2 shirts, which is ridiculous. I don't understand that, but
that is very surprising.
Actually wild that there hasn't been a Funko Pop of Nancy Drew.
Yeah, that
actually shocks me.
I know, it's very surprising. It would do very well. I mean, there's been people who have, like, a lot of people who have created custom Nancy Drew Funko Pops. I think they would sell really well if they actually made one.
I also had to look up the Crooked Banister. It reminds me, there was I want to say either a Tumblr dedicated to it, or maybe it was just a thread that was going around probably close to about 10 years ago. But it was people posting the covers of all the Nancy Drews just because, I mean, some of them are very dramatic.
Yeah.
And that's actually the reason why I didn't read them when I was little. So the covers tend to make it look more dramatic than it actually is. And so as a young kid, that was one of the reasons I'm like, this looks too scary. I don't think I'm going to like this. And then they're not that bad. Crooked Bannister is a little bit more lean that way just because it's the animatronic robot that's life-sized. So that's kind of creepy. But
I was always drawn to the creepier looking covers. That's, again, how we differ. I like the creepier. Like, I love any of the ones that have the ghost stories and stuff. I think they're way more fun. But I liked how they looked serious, though, because they looked intriguing. And I wanted to know what was happening. So, I don't know.
Just glancing over some of them, I will say, I mean, this one's a bit more ominous just because she appears to be spying on the Ku Klux Klan, but
that's basically what it was.
Like,
it was like a little cult.
These are very dynamic. Do you know offhand who the artist for these were?
It depends on what cover you're looking at. Russell Tandy did the original covers, and then Rudy Nappy did like basically all the rest of them for 1 through 56.
Some of these are very cool. It is one of those things I never really, surprisingly, given my family and our general like of mystery and horror, that I didn't really grow up with either Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys or even Encyclopedia Brown. I just sort of missed all of that somehow.
I loved Encyclopedia.
Yeah, we were very much Sherlock Holmes and Nate the Great for a little bit.
I haven't read Nate the Great, but I love Sherlock.
For me, to be fair, it was largely Goosebumps and Animorphs.
Oh, I love Goosebumps.
Don't get me started on Animorphs. Love that series.
Maybe a podcast for another day there.
I just sold like a bunch of Animorph books, actually.
The Animorphs covers, similarly, are covers that I always just, there's an immediate nostalgia seeing those.
The nice thing about them, and I gotta double check to see if we can get this in, they're re-releasing a lot of Animorphs as graphic novels.
They're doing that with the Babysitters Club, too.
Those are very popular.
Those are very popular.
Yeah. Well, to bring that back to Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys, there's Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys graphic novels, too.
You had mentioned, because I read the one they released in 2019.
Yeah, that's a comic book series, but there was actually a graphic novel spin-off of Nancy Drew Girl Detective and then the Hardy Boys Undercover Brothers. So it's like that universe, but in graphic novel form. And then there's the comic book. So there's the Big Lie comic book. And then there's a sequel to that one, which I haven't read yet, called The Death of Nancy Drew. And then there's another one that Dynamite Comics did called The Palace of Wisdom. So those are all the comic books. There's other Hardy Boys comic books, but those are like older, like from the 50s, because there was a Disney serial for the Hardy Boys, and there were comic books that went along with that. Then there was also a 60s Hardy Boys cartoon, and there's comic books for that as well.
I take it Nancy has never had so much a cartoon, though.
No, she hasn't, unfortunately. That would have been really cool.
That's surprising.
That's something I would expect Netflix or someone to pick something like that up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's you have 175-ish different stories to work from right off the bat.
Technically, over 600 with all the series. Yeah. They can do a lot with it.
Well, that brings up an interesting question. With all the places Nancy Drew has been, where would both of you like to see her next? A new medium or maybe one that hasn't been touched in a while?
I mean, I would personally love if the games would go to console. That would be really cool, so that we didn't just have to play it on the computer. I don't know. Everything has been made, basically, with her. I mean, there's board games, puzzles. I mean, a board game actually somewhat recently came out. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's a new board game. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't think this is very realistic, but I would love for there to be a Nancy Drew museum. Several years ago, just for fun, dreaming, I had drawn out what I would put in a Nancy Drew museum, wishing that there was a place that you could go. It could be towards both mediums, like where you could go and see information or items or like relic type ideas of like, here's things from the books, here's things from the movies, like costumes, here's things from the games. I would love for there to be a place where you could feel like you could step into a game where you could just go and see and explore or meet people dressed as the characters. I think that would be neat. There are conventions you can go to, but I would love for there to be like an actual museum where you could go and see a lot of everything all together.
You're in luck, Hannah, because at the Toledo Library, there's the Nancy Drew Jennifer Fisher collection room, and it's
I know, but it's not as big as I want it to be.
It's still like a museum, though, which is cool. You get to see various aspects of everything that has happened with Nancy Drew, which is very cool. There's also sometimes places that do Nancy Drew escape rooms, so that's something.
It's funny. I was just thinking that would be a really easy fit.
Yeah,
Glad to hear somebody's already running with that idea.
Yeah, I would love to go to one someday. That'd be super cool.
If anyone's looking for more information to learn about Nancy, there's a website, nancydrewfans.com. You can find out information about books, or you can find merchandise that's officially licensed. And then if you want to look up the games, herinteractive.com are both places.
NancyDrewFans.com has officially licensed merchandise. It's run by the president of the Nancy Drew Sleuths, Jennifer Fisher, and she has the power to officially license things through Simon & Schuster for Nancy Drew. So she has people who have made fan-made stuff and sell stuff on there. Her website about that has information on Nancy Drew is nancydrewsleuth.com. So that's a really good place. On my Instagram, I also share information about various items to help people collect and learn more. Another good place is seriesbooks.com. That has a lot of great information on Nancy Drew.
It really does sound like if you really want to get into Nancy Drew, there is a lot of resources and so many wonderful people in a very, very alive fan base.
Yeah, I mean, there's more than one Nancy Drew convention every year where hundreds of collectors and fans get together to do Nancy Drew stuff. Yeah, it's still a very, very active fandom.
That's actually pretty awesome to hear. So, running up on time, but I do want to ask, this is a character who has been around for 93 years. We've had, over 600 books, basically, you were saying. What do you think leads to this kind of staying power? What is it about Nancy Drew that keeps drawing people in?
I think she's somebody to look up to in a way. She's a great role model for not just girls, but boys too, on how to be a good person, basically, how to stick up for the little guy, how to step out of what society says you're supposed to be. Because back when Nancy first came out, girls were supposed to stay at home, be in the kitchen, stuff like that. But she went out and she went on adventures. She didn't care what everybody said. She just did her own thing. I think that's pretty appealing.
I would just say mysteries are a popular category. And so because Nancy has spanned so many different mediums, you're likely to find at least some medium with Nancy Drew that you're going to enjoy, whether it's a TV show, whether it's a book, whether it's a new book, or the team books, or the games. If you like mysteries, you probably will be able to find a Nancy Drew mystery that you love.
That's a really good point, yeah. And plus, what we were saying earlier, it's generational. So it's something to connect with other people about. With multiple generations in your family, it's something to connect with. So
I also have one further question. Since you both seem fairly familiar with the series, albeit in different forms, what's your favorite case?
That's so hard.
Doesn't have to be one you'd recommend, just whatever is your personal favorite.
For me, it's an easy answer because it's the very first game that I played. So it's Treasure in the Royal Tower, and it's set in a castle in Wisconsin, and Nancy gets snowed in, and the library has been vandalized. And so you're exploring this old castle, you're stuck with these people, you don't know who you can trust or who did this. And there's an old tower where Marie Antoinette, according to the game, used to stay. And so you just find out all this old history information, and I love winter anyway. And so I just think it's a really great atmosphere that they created. And the nostalgia is just so high because it's the first game that I played that is just definitely my absolute favorite case of Nancy's.
Yeah, I love that one too. My favorite, I would say Stay Tuned for Danger, which I think I did mention. It brings my love of Nancy Drew with my love of behind the scenes of TV shows because it takes place on a television set. It's got a murder. It's just I don't know. I just love that one. It was also one of my first games. It's the first game I remember playing, so it's very, very nostalgic for me. I absolutely love that one. And then book-wise, the most nostalgic one for me is The Secret in the Old Attic. There's something about it that's just so nostalgic for me. So I really, really love that one.
They both sound really, really interesting. All of them do, really. I have more questions than answers about the tower in which Marie Antoinette stayed in. And
in Wisconsin, wasn't that?
Yeah.
They transported the tower from France. He bought a tower and brought it over. Yes.
That makes a little more sense now. I assumed they were just lying.
No. They wrote the game so that this old eccentric person, really rich guy with this castle, he bought this house area from a town in France and brought it over, and it happened to contain clues related to Marie Antoinette and her old journal and all those things.
Which I think is exactly the same as the book.
It's very similar to the book. It's
almost exactly like the book, because the book, that's one of the few games where the book it's based on has the same exact title.
I have one less question, but then that just means I need to check out the game or read the book.
Definitely going to at some point have to read The Crooked Banister to figure out what is going on with this pots and pans robot.
That is one of the more bizarre Nancy Drew books. A random note is that the Nancy Drew book that is considered to be probably the most bizarre is Nancy Drew and the Flying Saucer Mystery. That was the very last book that Harriet Stratemeyer Adams wrote, and it is weird.
I'll have to keep that in mind as well.
Being honest, it's not what I was expecting you to say after Nancy Drew and the
Yeah.
of the multitude of things. I don't know if I would have ever guessed that.
Was not on the short list there, certainly.
Well, thank you both so much for coming onto the podcast and really, really expanding definitely my knowledge of Nancy Drew.
Oh, yeah.
It was fun.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
And you both run social media accounts. Is that where people can find like up-to-date stuff on like what's happening in Nancy Drew?
I have one where I talk about everything.
I don't have all the updates for like the new games that come out. I'll watch them. You can certainly follow the company's main account yourself if you want to see the updates. I like to engage and create content for the fans. So what I do is I might post a picture or different pictures of different characters from the games. And then I'll have polls where I see, well, who's your favorite character from this game? Or what do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? Or what would you do if you were in this situation? And so I try to make it interactive, not just like, here's a picture, like my picture, but here's something. And where would you go? Or what would you do if you were in this situation? What would Nancy do? What do you think about this thing? So that people really interact with the posts that I'm putting out there.
Yeah, and on mine, I share my collection piece by piece, and with each picture, I share as much detail as I can on that item, because my goal with my page is to help others, first of all, learn about Nancy Drew, but also know how to collect. So I share pieces of my collection as I go with information, tips, trivia, stuff like that. And when new stuff comes out, I like to try to share it as much as I can to my story so people are aware that something new with Nancy is happening. My Nancy account is nancy.drew.collector.
I had already said the one name, which is my Nancy Drew game account, is nancy.drew.nerd. My book account is itslocked.nancy.drew. It's Locked is just the very classic quote of Nancy Drew anywhere, and so that's why I wanted to incorporate that with Nancy Drew.
Once again, thank you both so much for coming on the show. Jeff, if people want to participate with the Geek Out podcast, where can they go?
Well, if you head on over to lansdownlibrary.org/podcasts, there'll be a green register here button. You click that and you just have to fill out a small form, and that lets us know you're interested in joining us on the podcast.
Until next time.